All right, everybody. So we're going to be talking about the chapter 1 from this week, which is podcasting growth, trends, and landscape. So I'm going to kind of go through some things. There's bits and pieces I will kind of skip over just because you're going to read it more in depth on the text or on the website, whichever one you choose to look at. So I will kind of skip around a little bit. So podcasting, is it the future of storytelling? Is it the future of radio? I think these are a lot of questions that people sometimes have. And sometimes people just have the question of what is podcasting? Not everybody listens to podcasts. So, podcast, they're one of the best platforms for storytelling because you could be a lot more personable with the listener. You can be a little bit more open and a lot more conversational. Normally, if it is a radio show, there is a very strict format. There's a script frequently with radio. I know when I've done radio in the past, there was a script that I needed to follow. I could kind of, make minor changes, but it's pretty scripty. Versus podcasts, they're a little bit more open, a little bit more personal. You can be a little bit more conversational. If you are talking with someone else, obviously there's a great conversation happening, but it's a little bit more enjoyable. All right. So podcasting, it actually became really big. I know there's people got into a lot of things during COVID. Some people baked, some people crafted, some people started podcasting or listening to podcasts. So it was just a great way to get information out there. So it was really a great way. I really like this whole statement about how mid-March 2020, they looked at, podcasts, and 22,000 episodes had the word coronavirus in the title or description. That's just, if that tells you anything about how much we were just using podcasting. And it really is. It's a great way for people to get information out there. One thing that they did notice was the listening time did change, but that completely makes sense. Like, think about it. You have to be at work at 8 o'clock. You're probably heading out the door, depending on how far you live from work. You might be leaving at 7 o'clock. Maybe you've got to get kids to school. But with everything, everybody working from home, everybody doing school from home, those times kind of got pushed back a little bit. So podcasting, its power and its ability to reach as a medium, it's huge. It's big enough that the U.S. Library of Congress, they added podcasting to its archives. So it's just, I think that really shows, and I really strongly believe the last year has really shown us how useful podcasting can be as a medium. Just think back to that statement, 22,000 titles or descriptions that have the word coronavirus. So it's just a great way to get information out there. So what is a podcast? Well, you are going to be making a couple of podcasts for this class. So definitely want to pay attention to what a podcast is. So the formal definition, traditionally, a podcast has been defined as a digital audio file available on the internet that can be downloaded on a computer or digital device and is automatically received by subscribers. But times are changing, and obviously there's multiple ways to tap into a podcast. It could be through YouTube, it could be through Facebook Live, rather than just necessarily a podcast app. And there's also so many options out there. So when did they start? So believe it or not, they actually kind of started back in 2005. That's when the first official podcast was used by the Oxford Dictionary. It was actually used by a journalist. The idea was used by a journalist. And some of the bigger boom years is 2014, the launch of Serial. But think about it, like, how many crime investigation shows do we have on television and our streaming devices and movies? So it actually makes a lot of sense that that's kind of where the boom in podcast came from, was in that kind of genre, like the crime investigation scene. So kind of seen a big boom throughout that. Narrative podcasts, they kind of grew from things like the Joe Rogan Experience. So these were all just kind of, more one-on-one people kind of just hanging out, having conversations. Advertising, definitely a big thing. Look at $1 billion in 2020. That's a lot. It was less than what they expected. Obviously, COVID, advertising went down just because of so many companies closing down and having to kind of be more conscious of their money. But I think as we are starting to see business starting to pick back up, I do think we could potentially see a huge boom. I think now people have started to embrace podcast. I do think we could see a boom in advertising revenue. So who does podcast? Really, that's the thing. Anyone can do podcasting. If you got a passion for something, if you have something that you want to talk about, you could be the person to create a podcast. And again, you'll actually create a couple different types. You're going to have a solo podcast for this class where you are just going to talk about something that you really enjoy. It's just going to be you and, well, most likely your computer, you and your computer just kind of talking it out. And then you'll have an interview session where you're actually going to find someone and you're going to talk to them about something that they're really passionate about and kind of interview why they're so passionate about this. So really, again, anyone, kids, tweens, teens, millennials, Gen X, boomer, and seniors, anyone is able to do a podcast. Really, it's a lot easier than a lot of people realize. Companies create podcasts. There's a lot of companies out there that will create podcasts to kind of give you information. REI, I know, has their podcast. I think it's mentioned in the textbook as well, where they just kind of give you information about outdoor activities, things that you can do, suggestions, so all kinds of stuff. I know there's a couple big brands, fashion brands, that they will also have a podcast. Colleges and universities, I know there's a lot of colleges and universities out there that they are starting to embrace podcasts because it's just an easy way to reach their student audience. If it's something they could just pop out there and it downloads for students. So it's really a great way to really get to know your college campus if your university has a podcast. So who is listening? When I actually saw this, I was actually kind of surprised because I'm a millennial and I just kind of thought, oh, that's my group. We're the ones that are totally dominating this podcast world. It's not. 12 to 24. So I was really shocked by that. But it just shows you, like, it's such a wide variety of people that are out there listening to podcasts. So there has been an increase in listening among teens and tweens. And I will say one thing that I have noticed, and this is, I think, over the last year, I think there have been a lot more podcasts, like educational podcasts that are geared towards younger kids. I've seen my daughter who's going into 3rd grade, they've used podcasts for them to kind of help them understand whatever reading activity they were doing or a math activity. So there is a lot of opportunity. There's also growth among the 55 plus demographic. I think just as podcasts are becoming more accessible to them, a little bit easier for them to navigate through things like their phones and their tablets, it's really taking off and it gives them something to kind of occupy themselves with. So the most used platforms, Spotify, Apple, Pandora, and then YouTube is also climbing, but there's also other options out there, SoundCloud, Google Play, and Podbean. For this class, we do use Podbean just because of, there's not a lot of these programs are starting to charge you to be able to upload. And as of right now, Podbean does not charge you to upload your podcast. So I think that is really important to find a free host. And of course, if that changes, I will definitely be searching for a new host. But there's different host sites that you can use for your podcast. But again, for this class, you will use Podbean for all 3 of the podcasts that you will be completing. So growth in podcast. I kind of already touched on this earlier. Content for kids, it's growing. I just think it's really a great way that you can tap into like educational needs for some of these kids. Lots of news. There's lots of news stuff out there. So it's a way that they can kind of tap in to kids and kind of inform them of things that are going on. And of course, there's always a gender gap. Women are approaching equality in podcast listening, but that's really been a significant growth over the last 3 years. And I would be really interested, because I think most of this data was collected in 2019. I would be really interested to see how these numbers have changed since COVID, and with all of, so many people working from home. Feeding the growth and popular topics. So obviously there's this whole thing where we see something that's doing really well, we're going to keep producing those kind of podcasts. We're going to go for what people are looking for. So some of the top: religion, comedy, society, and culture. Those are kind of some of the more popular things. True crime and investigation podcasts are among the most popular. And again, I go back to what I said earlier. Think about how many shows we have out there that are around crime investigations. I think it's a trend. So things that you see trending on TV, you're probably also going to see trending as podcasts. All right. So the best investigative podcasts focus on exposing injustice and righting the wrongs. Those are really the big things. And it's become so popular that in 2020, it became a Pulitzer Prize in audio reporting. There's a couple, your book does, or I'm sorry, the text for this week does cover this U.S. Supreme Court in 2019 that involved the murder conviction of a Black Mississippi man who was tried for murder 6 times. And I think this kind of got, swept under the rug. People didn't really pay attention to it until this was podcasted about and kind of got out there. So it's a great way to raise awareness. So it's always something to consider while you're thinking about what topics you're going to talk about. So how do you listen to a podcast? Where do I find a podcast? What do I need to do? Audiences can listen on a computer, go to any podcast website. I know when you sign up for Podbean for uploading your stuff, there's tons of podcast options on there. And most of the time, if you're really interested, let's say you're interested in sports, you can type in sports into the search bar, and they're going to come up with all kinds of sports podcasts for you. So that's definitely something you're going to want to take into consideration when you're trying to figure out what you want your podcast to be about. The most popular, and the way I listen to podcasts on my phone, I do have the Apple Podcast app. I've listened to a couple, but there's so many different ways to listen to them. So definitely check that out. I know I've got Audible, and I've noticed more podcasts have been coming up. Wasn't something available to me. So that's something I'm going to try to check out a little bit more, is what Audible has for podcasting. So new podcast episodes are automatically downloaded to the digital device and available for playback without the need for internet connection. So it's a really great way to keep up with what you're doing, so long as you are subscribing. So that is the biggest things for this week as far as this first chapter that we're focusing on podcasting. We will have more with chapter 4. So make sure you're taking some time to read through chapter 4 as well as listening to that lecture. I hope you all have a great day.